And now let's implement the feature of a player holding the current score. And let's again look at our flowchart here. And once again, this flowchart basically represents the division of our big problem, which is to implement this game, into smaller problems, which are all of these green, basically, sub-problems here. Now, what we are going to implement is the functionality of holding the score. And remember, that happens whenever the user clicks on that button to hold the score. So when that happened, we want to add the current score to the total score, right? So let's see that in the demo version here. So I'm reloading here. And then as I roll the dice, let's roll it again. So I have 8 current points. And as I click hold, you see that these points will basically be transferred to my global score. So in this case, 0 plus 8 will then be 8. And then we change to the next player. And so that's exactly what we have here in the flowchart, followed by switching the player. Now, this switching of player only happens when the score is still below 100, because when the score is at least 100, then the current player wins. Okay? And so now let's implement basically this logic that we have here. Okay. So we want something to happen when the user clicks on this hold button. So button hold, right? So let's take that and add an event handler. So button hold dot add event a listener. Once more on the click, and then once more our function value here, the function that will be executed as the user clicks the button. And so let's again write some comments to say what we want to happen here. First, add current score to the score of the active player. So active player's score. And then check score is already at least 100. And if so, then basically finish the game. And if not, then switch to the next player. All right, so now we want to define the current player's score. And remember how I told you in the last lecture that to store the scores, we are using this scores variable. And this scores variable is this array, which at the same time holds the score of player 0 and player 1. So player 0 at position 0 and player 1 at position 1. And so now we can use the active player variable to get the correct score of the current player. So scores at position active player, so that's what I just explained, will be equal that score plus the current score. So we say plus equal the current score. So again, when it's player 1, then this will be scores 1. But when player is 0, then it will be scores 0. And then we take that value and add the current score to it and assign it again to scores at the current active player. So just to make it 100% clear, if player is currently 1, then this would be this. Okay? So scores at 1 is equal to scores at 1 plus the current score. So I'm just going to leave it here as a comment so that you really understand what's happening here. So we changed that score, and now we of course need to display it as well. And so now we will do it in a similar way to as we did up here, where we basically select it based on the active player. So document.get element by ID. And now let's just check out again the name of the element. So that's score 0 and score 1. So these are the IDs. And again, we will replace 0 or 1 here dynamically. So again, a template string, current, and then here, the active player. So when it's player 0, it will be current 0. And so that first score will be selected. And when it's player 1, well, then the other element will get selected. And then we can set the text content to the score of the active player. So scores, active player. Give it a save. And so now our game should almost be finished. We will be able to play it basically until infinity, but it should work. But actually, it would not yet work because we haven't yet switched to the next player here. So right now, as we hold the score, we are not switching. So we are not checking if the score is greater than 100, but we are also not switching. And so let's leave that checking if the score is 100. So basically checking if the player won the game. Let's leave that for the end. And for now, let's just switch to the next player, because usually that is what needs to happen. So switching to the next player is this code. So it's going to be the exact same thing. We still need to reset the current score to 0 here, both in our program and also on the user interface, which is what we do here. We need to switch the player from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. And we need to toggle the player active classes to show which player is the active one. So all of this code here, we will need it again down here. So should I just go ahead and copy it now? And I hope that you already know the answer for that. So that would violate the don't repeat yourself principle. And so what I'm going to do is to simply take this code and put it into a function. And then I will call that function in both the places where I need this code to execute. So I'm cutting the code now here. And then up here, I will create a function. So I'm going to call this one switch player equals a function. And this function does not need any argument at all, or any parameter, because the code is exactly the same in both situations. So usually when we are refactoring something, like we are essentially doing here, then there is many times like a small thing that changes in the code. And then it's very useful to have a parameter so that when we call the function, we can specify what changes. So that's what we did when we refactored some code in the first project. But here, nothing changes. All we want to do is to simply repeat this code. And so we don't need any parameters and we don't need to return anything. This is simply just a reusable piece of code. And so let's call that here. Switch player, call it here, and call it here. And again, we will then put this in the if-else statement later once we check for the score to check if the player has won. But now we just want to make the game work. And so, of course, after we hold the score, we need to switch to the next player. So exactly as it says here in our flowchart, except that we're now skipping for now this part. So we're going from add current score to total score directly to switch player. Okay, and so now we should be ready to test our own version here. So now I have 6, let's hold it, and okay, something went wrong here indeed, because our score is still at 0, and that should not be happening. So let's check it out. And let's start by adding a console.log here, just to see if we are actually catching this event. So if we are handling it correctly. So hold button. So as I mentioned in the previous section, we really use console.log all the time to debug any kind of situation. And I could have just erased this part of the video showing you just a final solution, but I think it's a good idea to show you the debugging process right here in the video as well. So let's play and let's hold. And so we got the hold button here. So something worked. And actually, yeah, also the background color changed sides here and the current score was erased. So we already knew actually that something was indeed happening, but let's now actually find out what is going on here. And so now I want to log this value. Okay, so I'm basically now logging the score of the active player, and let me actually do that after I assigned it. So after we changed it, I will want to take a look at it in the console. Maybe the only problem is that it's not showing up in the element, so as the text content. But maybe the score itself is correct, and then we can see it in the console. So let's play again, and we already changed the player. And now I hold, and indeed, here we get 9. So that's the score that we had before. Let me show that to you again and reload. So I roll the dice 3, now I have 8, and watch what happens in the console as I click hold. And so indeed, I get the value of 8, which means that the score is actually correctly calculated. Now I just need to fix the part where it is not displaying here in this element. So here I selected current. So let me see. Oh, and yeah, that is of course a problem. It needs to be score. So it's score 0 and score 1, not current 0 and current 1. So that was the mistake. So here it is score. And now we can get rid of this console.log. And actually also of the other one that we have with the dice roll. So just make the code a bit better. Now I can close it up, roll the dice, and now as I hold, that should appear there, the number 4. And yes, now it works. Great. So let's play here a little bit. So now we accumulated 13 points. So let's hold them to end up with 17. And indeed, that works. Now let's hold these 4. And so I think this game is really a lot of fun to play, especially if you try it with someone else, which I actually did a couple of times as I was preparing this game, and I can tell you that it's really fun. But now let's actually get to the final part of this lecture, which is to check if someone reached the final goal of 100 points. And so if that happens, the game is over and we should not be able to click any of the buttons anymore. And we also want to assign a special class to the winner player to make it really obvious that that player has won. Okay, so let's add that check now. And so that shouldn't be too hard. So if scores at active player, so remember that is always here the score of the player that is currently active. So if that is greater or equal than 100, then the player has won. So this is where we finish the game. So when we finish the game, we want to assign a player winner class. And let me show that to you here in the CSS. So yeah, it's this one, player winner, which has this darker background color. So let me copy that. Paste that here. And now let's then select actually the player. So document.query selector. And let's again take a look at the code here, just so we don't make any mistakes. And so the player is really a class, player dash dash, and then the number of the active player. So that is player dash dash and active player. And then onto this element, we want to take the class list and add this class name that we just copied from our CSS. And then we also want to remove the active player class. Okay, so Where is that? Yeah, so when we switch the player, we turn on this player active, right? But now we then need to remove that, because otherwise we will have the active player class at the same time as the player winner class. So let's fix that. But we simply need to select the same element again, and then here we remove player active. Okay, I hope that made sense. And now let's test it. And to make it a little bit faster, let's actually test it just with 20. Otherwise, it's going to take forever to reach that 100 points. All right. Well, and before we do that, let's now actually put this switching the player into the else block. Okay. So when the game finishes, we of course do not want to switch the player, but if it does not, only then we do switch the player. And remember that 20 points is enough to win. So let's roll the dice a couple of times. 11, so we're almost there. That was close with 16. And so now we should have enough. So if we hold now, then 10 plus 11 here is 21. So that's over 20. And so now this should then show us the winner player class. Well, that didn't really happen. That's weird. If I keep clicking here, then this number keeps getting added. And let me see in the HTML if the class wasn't added, but actually it was not. So we still have the active player, and the winner class is nowhere to be found. So let's check that. Oh, and here we actually have the problem. So I did a mistake that I told you before not to make, which is when we use query selector, we need an actual selector. So here we are selecting a class, and so we're missing the dot here and here. So only when we get element by ID, then we do not specify the selector, we only specify the ID name itself. But when we use query selector, this needs to be a query. And so if we are selecting based on a class, we need the dot here. And so that should be fixed now. But this is great to show you that mistakes like this happen in development all the time. So if you do this yourself, then really don't beat yourself up, because that's just completely normal, as you're seeing here. I didn't plan these mistakes. Anyway, now we have 16 plus 5 is 21, so that should be enough to win the game. Now we really got this winner class here, showing that player 1 won the game. So this is now red too, and yeah, the dark background here too. Now the problem is, first, that we're still showing the dice, so we want to get rid of that. But even worse is that we can still click on these buttons. We can actually still keep playing the game. So you see that everything works the same, and now this player also won, they also have 22 points, but we still can keep playing the game. So of course, that is not good. So that is the next thing that we need to solve, and let's think how we could solve this. And for me, I think the easiest solution is to create a variable that holds the state of the game. So if we are still playing or not. So this is going to be a state variable, which kind of tells us the condition of a system. And in this case, the condition will be, is the game playing or not? And so if the game is playing, then we can click these buttons and then everything will work as normally. But then as soon as the game is finished, we will say that the game is no longer playing. And then we can no longer click on these buttons. All right? I hope that sounds good to you. So let's implement it. And so what I will do here is say, let playing, and now this will be a Boolean value. And so we start with true. So in the beginning of the game, we are of course playing. And so playing is true. And then when we finish the game, we will set playing to false. So that's in this case. So finish the game. And the first thing that we're going to do is to set playing to false. Okay. Now this in itself will of course not yet do anything. So we only defined whether the game is playing or not, but none of our code is reacting to that. So remember that we only want to be able to click on these buttons once we are playing. And so let's define that. So let's go to the first button, which is the button roll. And so basically what we can do now is that all of this logic that we have here should only be executed if we are playing. All right, so that's simple enough. So let's just say if playing, then do all of this. So let's remove that from here and put it down here. And then as we save it, Prettier will take care of indenting all the code and put it nice and beautiful. Okay. Now, playing here is a Boolean variable, and so that's why we don't have to write any condition like this, for example, because, again, playing itself is already a Boolean, so we don't need to check if true is equal to true. And so now when we click on this button while the game is no longer playing, then nothing will happen. And so that's the beauty and the goal of having this playing variable. And now let's simply do the same for this other button. Okay, so if playing, then do all of this. And again, I'm deleting it from here and simply writing it down here. Give it a save, and then it will be beautiful and back to normal. And so now, as soon as one player wins, we will finish the game and set playing to false. And so the next time we click on any of these buttons, then here playing will be false, and then none of this code will be executed. And the same here for this button for rolling the dice. So I hope you were able to follow that logic, and so maybe you can use this kind of logic in your own projects as well. And this is actually the reason why it's so cool to start building projects as games. Because in games, we need a lot of this type of logic. And so it's really fun to demonstrate all these different aspects that are quite common actually in programming. So state variable like this playing here, is very usual in programming. And so you can start to get used to sometimes needing a variable like that. And now let's try it out again. And remember that we still can win the game at 20. And just to make sure, let's reload. And now as I roll the dice, so let's hold here. And let's see if we can do it in one run. Oh, and we can. So we are at 20. And now let me hold. And now I won the game here. And now let's see what happens when I click. And nothing happens. The same for hold. So these buttons, of course, like you can still click them, but nothing happens. All right, that's awesome. There's just one last thing to do, which is to get rid of this dice here. So let's go back one last time. And so that also happens here when we finish the game. So remember that we displayed the dice up here when we roll the button. And so let's just copy this and basically add this hidden class back on. So right here, for example. And so now instead of removing it, we just add it back. Okay, give it a save. And let's try to do it fast again. And yes, now we should win the game and the dice is gone. Awesome. So we are almost done here with this project. So our game works really great. All there's left to do now is to implement this new game button here. So we could of course play again by reloading the page, but it's always nice to have a button to simply reset the game. And so let's move on to the next video and do that to finish this project.